Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where in the world you happen to be. And thank you for joining us for Shifting Priorities, COVID-19 and the New Face of Sustainability, brought to you by the Center for Food Integrity and supported with funding from the United Soybean Board. I'm Charlie Arnot, your host, CEO of the Center for Food Integrity, a not-for-profit organization whose sole mission is to help the food system earn consumer trust. You've had an opportunity, hopefully, to be exposed to CFI. If you have not, I encourage you to go to foodintegrity.org to get more information about who we are and what we do, how we operate. You can see a sample of the logos and organizations on the screen with whom we engage to help build consumer trust across the food system. We are diverse by design, and our board of directors includes retailers, restaurants, those in the supply chain, and others as well. So I encourage you to learn more about CFI. Information about the CFI Speakers Bureau and other activity at foodintegrity.org. Today, I am very excited to be joined by Kevin Ryan and Ujwal Arkalgud. Those of you who have participated in CFI Now, our Friday updates, have had a chance to hear some of the excellent insight that Ujwal and Kevin provide. Kevin is founder of Malachite Strategy and Research. He has nearly 20 years of experience leading innovation and strategy at General Mills and Amazon, and his advanced degrees in food science and food anthropology. Kevin, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Ujwal is an award-winning cultural anthropologist and founder of MotivBase, an ethnography research company that performs big data ethnography research on demand. He's also the co-author of a new book, Microcultures: Understanding the Consumer Forces That Will Shape Our Future and the Future of Your Business. Ujwal, welcome.
Thank you.
Both Ujwal and Kevin are founding members of CFI's Consumer Trust Insights Council. That's a group of consumer insight experts and social scientists to explore emerging trends, to provide insights, to inform strategy for the food system. You can learn more about the group and what they do as well at foodintegrity.org. So a bit about our agenda today. In the webcast today, Ujwal and Kevin and I will take an in-depth look at new sustainability priorities that are emerging during the pandemic and why they're happening. What's ahead? How will shifting priorities continue to shape the sustainability landscape once the pandemic subsides? What are the new non-negotiables for food companies and brands moving forward, things you should absolutely pay attention to? And finally, I will detail a three-pronged approach for navigating sustainability trade-offs and making values-based decisions for you and your organization. We're thrilled with the attendance today. Roughly 500 people registered from 7 different countries, so we welcome your participation. Our goal is that you come away with new insights into a quickly evolving environment and how to implement strategies that are truly sustainable. So logistics, just a quick note before we get underway here. Everyone is muted, so please submit any questions or comments you have via the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom window. By now, I think we're 8 weeks, 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 12 weeks into the pandemic, so everyone should be intimately familiar with how to operate Zoom. We will get to those questions then later into the webcast. Also appreciate your feedback. For the end of the webcast, I'm going to include a link in the chat box for a survey. It'll take about 10 seconds for you to complete. So I will hum the theme to Jeopardy while you go through and actually click on the link and complete the survey. So with that, let's get started. We are seeing relatively rapid shifts in sustainability priorities as COVID-19 continues. Things like a focus on health and safety, people rethinking packaging and single-use plastics. What do they mean today in light of food safety, and how do we balance food safety, convenience, and public health? And obviously worker health and safety has been front and center across many different sectors of the food system as those essential workers continue to make sure we have food for our grocery stores, as well as all the healthcare providers that are working hard to protect us and treat us in light of the pandemic. So let's get started. We'll dig into the details. Ujwal, we're going to open with you. How are things shaping up and shaking out? What changes are temporary, and what will the new normal look like from your perspective?
Great, thank you. So I had my team of anthropologists run some analysis with our technology, MotivBase. And before I dive into some of the interesting demand spaces that are sort of getting accelerated because of this pandemic, I just want to explain what you're seeing on your screen. What you're seeing is obviously a version of the diffusion of innovation curve, but in this particular case, what we're really plotting here, on the y-axis, we're plotting growth. On the x-axis, so that's your growth rate. On the x-axis, we are plotting what we call maturity. The simple way to think about this is when a demand space falls in this zone, it has mainstream acceptance. So as you can see, first and foremost, nothing has mainstream acceptance just yet. I don't think that's a big surprise to anybody, especially when we dive into a couple of these demand spaces. However, what's interesting is the way some of these demand spaces have been re-energized in the midst of this pandemic. And I want to focus on a couple of them and draw out a few insights that I think are just not just surprising, but also just fascinating in helping us understand what's going on in the consumer psyche here. And by the way, for the sake of simplicity, this is data that's looking at the United States as well as the UK. So those are the two markets we've looked at here. So let me talk about a couple of the demand spaces that are really, really interesting in particular. The first one I want to focus on is shortening the supply chain. The consumer is talking about a term called food miles. This kind of terminology we have not seen in the consumer language that commonly. It is something that is not only increasing in the way the consumer is talking about it, but also the consumer's understanding of what that means to them. This notion of wanting to buy, in essence, foods that potentially travel shorter distances than they're traditionally used to traveling. That's the simple way the consumer thinks about it. Ultimately, obviously, it has bigger implications in terms of not just the sourcing of ingredients, but of course the sourcing of major parts within the food system itself, which we can come to as the discussion unfolds here. But shortening the supply chain, the interesting thing about this particular demand space, and I'm going to jump to the example here. The interesting thing about this particular demand space is that, as I mentioned, it's pre-mainstream acceptance, but there's a lot of growth, and there's about a 47% growth year over year happening in the consumer's understanding of what this thing means to them in their lives. So again, this is really fascinating. We can see in the pre to post-COVID era, or I'm already saying post-COVID, but I should say in the pre and current COVID era, we're already seeing the rate of acceleration from a topic that was confusing to the consumer to a topic that is achieving some level of consistent growth. Now, I want to pinpoint a couple of interesting things that I'll come back to in a second. First, take a look at the dominant motivation that's driving the consumer here. It's this notion of overcoming human limitation through technological innovation. I will tell you this, these kinds of topics pre-COVID were peppered in with these kinds of mindsets before. It was really about the sustainability game. It was really about trying to shed light on large corporations and how they only want to make money and all that kind of narrative. The fact that that's getting bumped down, and instead now the motivation is really revolving around this notion of using technology for the betterment of the food system. And of course, in this particular case, using technology to achieve more sustainable outcomes. I think that's quite fascinating. And I'll come back to that in a second as we talk about a couple of the other demand spaces as well. But I just wanted to pinpoint that for you, in addition to a couple of the related attitudes about obviously buying local or wanting to advocate for things that are scientifically driven. Now, another demand space that I also want to focus on here is this one here around hydroponics and vertical farming. Again, nothing new, but coming into increasing focus. But here's the part that really surprised us: hydroponics and taste. There's not only more discourse now in mainstream media about how hydroponics could be used, or new innovative ways to leverage hydroponics to improve the taste of produce, but also we're seeing consumers share these kinds of articles and talk about these kinds of things. As a consumer myself, I had no idea that there was a connection between the two until my researcher did this work and sent it to me, and I was surprised to see that. But I think the fact that consumers are already starting to talk about it, again, this is pre-mainstream, bear in mind, but massive growth. Now, let me jump to the hydroponics example here for you. Same thing you'll see in the adoption curve. even earlier and even smaller in relevancy. And this is in the United States, for example, just relevant to about 17 million people, very, very tiny, but even bigger growth than the notion of shortening the supply chain. So just really, really interesting to note how some of these demand spaces are coming into focus, and the consumer's knowledge base around the use of some of these techniques or some of these strategies to achieve more sustainable outcomes in the food system. I think that's what's interesting, is the growth in the consumer's knowledge around this. Now, what I want to do here is I want to hit the compare button here, because I want to show you something that my team put together where they compared 3 demand spaces. Obviously, I showed you 6 in the visual earlier, but I want to look at 3 just to simplify the narrative here. 3 important demand spaces emerging, hydroponics or vertical farming, shortening the supply chain, and then this whole notion of lab or cultured meat, another one that is experiencing growth. If you compare the 3, shortening the supply chain is the most mature of them. And by the way, if you compare all 6 of the demand spaces that are undergoing some amount of acceleration right now, shortening the supply chain is the top there. Again, pre-mainstream, but now's the time to think about innovative solutions that can address those kinds of needs emerging from the consumer. So that's the first thing I wanted to show you. The next thing I wanted to show you, and I think this is just immensely interesting to see. Have a look at, now innovation is usually a class issue, and I'm going to say this, obviously it doesn't apply to every situation, but most of the time, especially in the food system, we see this where innovative solutions are generally, or the need for innovation is generally led by consumers that are upper middle class or higher. And there's some logic behind it, of course. People need to have the money, the time, the resources, the knowledge, the education to be able to think about and make considered decisions, and to be able to say, I'm going to spend the extra money for something that isn't freely available, and so on and so forth. So generally, it is a class issue, and generally it takes time for innovation to get adopted by the mainstream, because that class boundary has to fall at some point. What's interesting when you just compare these 3 demand spaces is that shortening the supply chain is the one demand space that actually pretty much mirrors, and this is not just in the US, we saw this in the UK as well, pretty much mirrors the population spread across income and socioeconomic class. I think that's fascinating, as opposed to hydroponics or vertical farming, lab cultured meat. They do skew towards wealthier families, wealthier communities. They do skew towards the upper middle class, if you will. So that's another interesting insight, which is that this not only shortening the supply chain, kind of leading the pack, it's also the one most likely to achieve mainstream significance, because the class divide isn't as strong or pretty much doesn't exist. The other interesting thing to also note is that it's also one where you see all kinds of types of family units. You see parents with children, you see parents without children, you see single people, as opposed to, let's say, lab or cultured meat, which really is driven by single consumers and consumers without children. And then the last part I want to highlight is when you look at the common motivations, and again, for simplicity, I've just pulled up 3, but it applies to all 6 of them. All 6 of them have this shared motivation of wanting to use technological innovations to solve for the sustainability problem. Again, this is new. Typically, we see these kinds of motivations. The moment you start to study sustainability, you see the type of consumer that says, I distrust every corporation. I want to vote with my wallet. I want to shout from the rooftops. I want to do whatever I can to change the narrative. And we need to lobby Congress or the House of Commons and so on and so forth. You see that mentality. What we're seeing here is different. You're starting to see, it still exists, of course, but you're starting to see a type of person, a community of people that actually are looking at the same types of innovations that maybe took us away from sustainability. They want to have the same mindset, but to adopt them to solve for some of the sustainability challenges that are coming up. So that's the part that I really wanted to highlight, because these are some of the significant shifts that we've seen in the pre to now let's call it the COVID 2.0 era that we're seeing. And then the one last thing I'll mention here, which I think will give some of you on the call some relief, is that availability and price is still very much relevant. It's not going anywhere. And of course, I'm sure, as all of you know, price is even greater of an issue at the moment. And so availability and price, definitely part of the equation. They're not going anywhere. Taste, part of the equation. It's not going anywhere. But I think, again, the use of technology to solve for some of these sustainability issues, I think, is the fascinating part. And we can see some of the demand spaces that are starting to emerge as a result of it.
Excellent, Ujwal. Very interesting. And I'll pose just one question for you and Kevin to kind of provide some feedback on. And again, we'll address your questions here toward the end, but please submit your questions versus at the bottom of your toolbar, you'll see the Q&A or chat function. Please submit your questions there. But some of this seems a little counterintuitive to me. Normally, and of course, I'm looking at it through the lens of someone who spent my career in the food system and food and agriculture. We think about technology as a tool to increase efficiency, increase productivity, and that's kind of been at odds with the consumer ethos of sustainability. And right. I want simpler products. I want products that are less processed. I want all of that. And we at least within the industry, we equate technology as being something that increases processing, increases efficiency, increases all throughput, all of that. How do we reconcile that? Because this is fascinating, because technology obviously can play a critical role in making the food system more sustainable, decreasing food miles, shortening the supply chain, all of that. But this is different.
I think a couple of the interesting things we're seeing is, take hydroponics as an example. If you look at outcomes in terms of usage of water, as an example with hydroponics, the perfect example of how technology can make something better for the environment and potentially better for the farming community as well. Now, there are many other data points that obviously we didn't include here for the sake of time and simplicity, but consumers are talking about all kinds of interesting technologies that are being employed, even in, for example, the dairy industry. There's discussions about technologies that is allowing the use of certain types of biodiesel or bio-waste-based fuel systems in order to power plants and processing units. So there's a lot of that kind of technology being discussed as ways to make gains in traditional, or how the consumer sees traditional practices in the food system. I think that's what's fascinating about this. And of course, along that journey, there's also increased efficiency, there's cost savings potentially. But the dairy farming one is an interesting one, right? Where you can see the narrative play out between consumers saying, this kind of biofuel is powerful because it reduces emissions significantly from the dairy industry. But the farming community acknowledges the immense cost of it, which means the expectation is the government must step in to provide subsidies and to support these kinds of innovations as well. So that's the last part I'll say, is that the consumer isn't saying it's only up to the corporation or the cooperatives or the entities or the farmers to deal with this. They also expect governments to do their part in this way. But I think that's really the shift in mindset that's interesting to see here.
Excellent. So Kevin, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I will. What are your thoughts on that in terms of I think it's fascinating, the use of technology being something that consumers are now discussing as it relates to shortening the supply chain, et cetera, which would be antithetical to what we've seen historically.
No, I actually have something in my slides that's kind of the same. It doesn't speak specifically to the technology piece, but it definitely speaks to the idea that I'm starting to see consumers wanting some type of ability to solve this issue or issue, and whether or not it starts with COVID and then moves on to a sustainable issue, you're seeing more of consumers wanting that type of thing. And so I think the technology piece just makes sense from that sense. Is the idea that, if they can see it as a practical solution that actually does make sense, I think that it's in line with the way in which corporations have been solving their problems. If you look at the way that Amazon or Tesla or whatever is taking the reins and actually solving a problem, I can see how they could see it like that. And I speak to it a little bit in my slides as well.
Great. Well, that's a good time to transition. So Ujwal, if you will stop sharing, and Kevin will give you the opportunity to share and jump in. Questions are starting to come in. Continue to submit your questions and thoughts, and I will begin to synthesize some of those and share those with Kevin and Ujwal once we get to the Q&A section. Kevin, it's all yours.
Yep. So just to give a little bit of background, so the first part of my slides really speak to my company does a lot of work where we will go in and actually work with CPG companies, retail companies, and actually, or at least for the last couple of months, have done a lot of work facilitating conversations about strategies. What are we going to do post-COVID, to use Ujwal's conversation? What are we going to do? And so these are, at least the first part of this is kind of my take on the conversations that are happening in that room. Of course, no confidentiality there, but what conversations am I seeing coming up over and over again within these companies? What are the themes when it comes to sustainability and COVID? So the first thing I'm going to talk about, because I will talk a little bit about consumer, is the corporate attitudes and the challenges that I'm seeing as the COVID situation and sustainability come together. The first one is I'm seeing a switch, and this probably won't be surprising to a lot of the people listening, but I'm starting to see a switch between sustainability being a marketing buzzword that, for some companies have used it as a marketing buzzword, that we're sustainable or whatever, turning it into now it really is a supply chain security issue. I'm hearing that from a number of different clients in the sense of COVID has brought attention to the fragility of the supply chain for a lot of corporations. And for those CPG companies and retail companies that are able to put thought to this right now, because a lot of them at the beginning of this didn't have the ability to put thought to it because they had to deal with COVID issues, they are now seeing this as if a sustainability issue came up, if we had a perfect storm of sustainability issues that came up, this could be, and you probably have heard this term, green swan. Probably if people are familiar with the term black swan, the idea of an unforeseen event that's catastrophic, I'm hearing the term green swan come up, the idea that there could be green swans that could take down the food industry. We need to be prepared for that, is what I'm hearing behind the scenes, and taking this even more seriously, not just because it's a good marketing, not because we want to be good for our shareholders in any other way. It's good for our bottom line as well. It really is good for our bottom line because we're seeing that we could not sustain this. So you're seeing this conversation come up again and again, is that we've been serious before. I'm not saying that companies haven't been, but we're going to get even more serious about this. So you're seeing sustainability in some areas being talked about like that. The next one is this idea, and I think Ujwal talked a little bit about it, but how supply chains are changing, and I take that as deglobalization. So how will deglobalization affect sustainability? Is it a stimulus for sustainability? So for apologies to Thomas Friedman, his famous book, The World is Flat, you're actually starting to see that change. I actually say that the world's no longer, or it's becoming not as flat, it's actually becoming segmented and balkanized, if it's anything. And a lot of that had to do with the inability to source materials during COVID. People started seeing, how are we going to be able to make our supply chain more robust? And with all the political aspects of the supply chains as they are, will that deglobalization, how will that's going to affect our sustainability efforts? And what a lot of it's going to do is, at least from the conversations I've been having, it's rethinking sourcing. And while we have these specs open, while we have these supply chains open, how are we going to think about this from a sustainable perspective? How are we going to think about this in the idea that we're not as flat and able to be as global as possible because it's not leading to as robust of a supply chain as we need? So you're really seeing those two worlds come together, this idea of a non-flat world, this, as I said, a balkanized world, a very conflicting world, and the sustainability aspect of it. The next one is the economic decarbonization, as I've said. I think those of you listening probably have seen this, that as we've seen the, people driving less and the less energy in COVID, COVID has really been dealt a pretty harsh blow to coal plants and to oil and gasoline production. Will that ramp up afterward? Of course, but you're starting to see that the cost of running these plants and things like that is actually showing some positivity toward green energy. And I think that, is this the demise of traditional energy, petroleum-based energy sources? It's still, potential for that. But if you look at what some investing groups like Morgan Stanley and things like that, what they're investing in, they're still investing in green solutions. And I'm hearing from a number of clients that they're moving in the same way as possible because they see post-COVID that a lot of infrastructure building phase will be taking place. US, EU, China, a lot of them look like that they will be green initiatives, and getting on the back of those, building with those, is something that I'm hearing from a number of clients, is how are we going to plug ourselves into these green initiatives from a supply chain, production, all that kind of thing. How are we going to be thinking ahead as we start going toward that post-COVID world where those infrastructure and where that green energy solutions seem to be the way in which people are going. So putting those two together is something I'm hearing from clients. Now moving to consumer attitudes, and I think a lot of this lines up with what Ujwal already said, and I'm just probably piggybacking off a lot of what he said. But the first one is, I don't know if you've heard NATO actually referred to COVID as this common invisible enemy. And this idea that COVID is this unforeseen and also unseen threat on the population of the world. What I'm starting to hear from consumers as my team's doing, consumer research, is the idea that not only is it highlighting the common invisible enemy of viruses, but also for some consumers, not all consumers, but for some, especially more of your organic, natural consumers, this heightened threat of invisible enemies and the idea of unseen elements like pollution and pesticides seems to be ramping up for some of these consumers. And this idea that the fact that we're not immune to them, and the idea that I need to increase my body's immunity, and also to be hypervigilant toward the idea of pesticides, pollution, and all that kind of thing. So how is that going to amplify? A number of my clients are actually looking at that and saying, does this speak to a new side of organic and natural? The third wave of natural organic, or whatever you want to say, but how is that going to affect it? So there's a lot of buzz going on a number of my clients for that reason. The second, and I think Ujwal talked about this too, is there's definitely this sense of, from consumers, a leadership vacuum. This idea that regardless of political affiliation, many consumers are seeing that they're not impressed with how leadership that has been shown during COVID and the response to it. And there's a potential for brands to step in and actually say, we're showing some leadership here. And that can start on COVID and then get translated into environmental aspects. And some of that, to Ujwal's sense, could be towards technological basis, some sort of basis to say, we are taking very practical, decisive steps and bold initiatives as a brand, as a corporation, in order to get our COVID aspects in line, as well as getting toward our environmental aspects in line. And I think you're seeing that coming through from a number of different consumers, or at least from the work that we're doing. And then lastly, I would say is, and I think this one will be, this one is to me extremely interesting, which is you're starting to see a politicalization of the environmental debate as it relates to COVID. This idea that on the pro-environmental side, you're seeing, that COVID is leading to, look at the cleaner air we're getting as people are not driving, and that plants, coal plants aren't firing. And also, if there's a strong enough threat, that governments and agencies can do coordinated action against something. So it's almost like a dry run for climate control or things like that. That's on the pro side. On the con side, it's the idea that the economic toll that a Green New Deal or something like that would be worse than COVID, and the idea it could take down economy. So you're seeing this being politicized in a number of different realms. And I think, as I'm looking at all of this, that companies need to find a non-politicalized way, a middle way. And the way I think about it is, my company's done a lot of work on the understanding of how people think about, veganism versus eating meat, and how the idea of that language was changed more toward for a more mainstream consumer by not calling it vegan and not calling it meat, but calling it plant-based, right? Is there a middle line here as we go forward to not get into the political fray of these two sides, and instead aligning sustainability efforts in a different way? Maybe it's frugality, maybe it's thriftiness as we start moving into a recession, maybe it's a different way of thinking about it. But I think not getting muddled into the politicalization that everything in our world tends to get muddled in anyway might be an interesting way, and a way that I think a number of companies are starting to think about. So with that, that's my quick spiel.
Excellent. Appreciate that. Well, thank you, Kevin. Appreciate that. And Ujwal, thank you for your insight as well. I'm going to share some of the tools that CFI has available to help companies address this. Continue to submit your questions. There's some really good questions coming in, some questions I think will challenge us and challenge our thinking, and look forward to getting to those questions here in just a little bit. CFI has been working for some time to help organizations figure out how to navigate this balancing act. How do we balance the demands of competing stakeholders with the commitments to improve sustainability of the entire system? All of that got more complicated as a result of COVID. And so hopefully these tools will continue to be more useful as this conversation continues. We've seen increased interest in large multinationals. We've seen increased interest from domestic companies in trying to figure out how do we do a better job of balancing these competing priorities. In secondary research, we identified several hundred different individual attributes of sustainability being addressed by some company or some organization across the food system. You can see some of them there on the screen, but they are many more fold in terms of the type of the numbers and issues that people are trying to address through their supply chain, through their organization. So it becomes a complex issue, and increasingly complex as people are looking to balance the social, economic, and environmental challenges that we've seen. Kevin mentioned the interest in the investment community. Clearly, BlackRock's letter earlier this year to their companies as well as to their clients, saying essentially that sustainability and climate change was going to be a fundamental factor used in the evaluation in their investing decisions, is a clear signal, another clear signal that things are fundamentally changing. So we like to talk about optimizing sustainability and have 3 tools available to help you do that. We are agnostic when it comes to an outcome. We want to provide tools that support the decisions that are right for you and your organization. 2 things we're trying to do, one of them today, food system stakeholders help foster that broad-based food system conversation about the impact of individual decisions. We work and live in this highly integrated system, and you can't pull one lever without having an impact on the entire system. So how do we take advantage of better understanding those trade-offs as we begin to have that conversation? And then ultimately, we want to engage more with consumer influencers. Want to continue to recognize those who've made this work possible. You can see them on the screen. And of course, today's webinar is supported through funding from the United Soybean Board to continue this ongoing food system conversation and dialogue. So the 3 modules we have available: setting sustainability priorities, evaluating sustainability trade-offs, and then how do you respond to requests for commitments. All of these are available free of charge through the foodintegrity.org website. We're also more than willing to help you navigate these and provide support as you do so. So module 1 about setting sustainability priorities. It's an 8-step process to evaluate and prioritize what's most relevant to you and your organization. What we have found is if you don't have that prioritization upfront, you find yourself essentially blowing in the sustainability wind because you haven't identified the values and the priorities that are relevant to your organization. It provides a foundation to help build that strategy or programming to provide guidance, and most importantly, it incorporates your business objectives and your company values. So those guide your sustainability strategy going forward. And it results in the sustainability priorities and rationale that can really help you feel more comfortable as you evaluate the options and trade-offs available. You can see the 8 different steps there all the way through the process, but it's a very straightforward process. Again, the tools are available to you, and we are available to you to help you navigate through those going forward. Module 2 is all about evaluating sustainability trade-offs. Again, there are always trade-offs with any sustainability decision that you make because we operate and work in an integrated food system. So what we want to do is to provide that 4-step process to help you evaluate the potential impact of a practice or policy in the supply chain when you set priorities or contemplate change. So when people for the preservation of X come forward, or someone in the supply chain comes forward and thinks, well, we ought to do Y, you have the opportunity to evaluate the potential impact of that and make that informed decision. Again, we want to start by identifying the non-negotiables based on your values and priorities. So today, public health and food safety would likely be non-negotiables, and anything that you are being asked to do that would put public health or food safety at risk, simply not a conversation you're willing to have today. Then you gather the life cycle assessment, sustainability data, summarize that data so you can visualize the impacts that are being evaluated, and then evaluate those trade-offs so you can make those decisions based on your values and your priorities. Again, it starts by identifying those non-negotiables up front. That gives you permission to say yes, and it also gives you permission to say no. People are making requests or suggesting that you make changes that are simply completely misaligned with your values. So it's important to identify those going forward. We have a handful of examples of different practices that you can evaluate on the website again, or we take a look at the practice or the policy, what's the impact from the environment standpoint, the economic standpoint, the social standpoint, and all of these then are supported by additional data. So you've got the easy to view data dashboard that you can look at online, but then it is supported with additional data behind that. So whether it is corn production or broiler production or other practices, you can go into the system and look at what are the potential impacts? Are those aligned with our values? Are they aligned with our business objectives? If yes, great, let's make that decision. If not, we'll have to look at it some other way. But the important thing here is on the broiler production one, just note that animal welfare is marked there in red with an X. That's a non-negotiable. So in this particular instance, if someone were to ask you to make a change that would have a negative impact on animal welfare, you would simply say that's a non-negotiable item for us. And so we simply aren't willing to make that kind of choice in our production system. Then module 3, responding to requests for commitment. Oftentimes organizations can be easily overwhelmed when, again, people for the preservation for X come to you and say, we would like for you to make a decision that's aligned with our organization's values and objectives. How do you engage in that conversation? And we've developed a decision tree and process to evaluate those requests and respond in a way that allows you to respond that's consistent with your values and your business objectives, rather than simply responding in a conversation in some kind of a vacuum. So again, it starts with understanding the issue, evaluating the source. Does it align with your current strategy? You plan your engagement and your response strategy, and then it allows you to move forward. So again, it's a decision tree that allows you to walk through the process and understand each step of the process, and then make a decision that's right for your organization based on your values and your business objectives. And again, we're agnostic as to the decision you make. We simply want to provide tools that help you make an informed choice and understand the potential trade-offs as you work through that process. So the takeaways from our perspective, sustainability priorities are shifting. You've heard that from Ujwal and Kevin. It's important to assess the trade-offs to assure decisions optimize sustainability and align with your company and organizational values. It's less today about a single issue, more about balance and optimization. And that's going to continue to be more true as things become more complex. You want to communicate your decisions transparently, be prepared to support your position through consistent engagement, and broad-based support for optimization will create a more balanced conversation. So if we can be helpful in supporting that, please let us know. We'd be happy to engage in that conversation. So we're going to jump now to the Q&A. We've allowed plenty of time to get to your questions and to conversation. Interesting question here. What is the main channel, or let's broaden that, what are the main channels through which consumers are getting their information about new food technologies? Is it retailers? Is it media? As we look at the hyper-segmented way that we get information today, it's more tribal and insular. What are the channels through which people are getting their information?
It's a great question. The majority of it, it's not often talked about, is actually happening on forums and blogs. That's really where the magic is. It's not Facebook or Instagram. It's really forums and blogs. There's an innate trust that consumers have ingest the knowledge that they can share with one another, whether it's a platform like reddit.com or babycenter.com or wherever else. And the same applies for bloggers who are, sources of expertise, who, they're bloggers with PhDs in various sciences that will talk about, food technologies and the application of it to the day-to-day living, things like that. So that's really where we're seeing a majority of the action happening, especially with the not so mainstream consumer. Once you come to the mainstream, it spreads more to mainstream news and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I would add to that too, beyond a technological channel, I would say that what I've seen with consumers is there's so much to be knowledgeable of. I mean, of course, if you're a tip of the spear consumer, you're reading those blogs on you're doing your homework. But if you're a mainstream consumer, you rely on your friends that are the expert to kind of give you in and kind of bless the news and the things so that you don't have to pay as much attention to all of that material. So from a non-tech channel, it's the friend who is knowledgeable that I trust to tell me about this and give me a crib sheet of what I need to know and what I need to trust. Excellent.
Great question. This one kind of sums up some of the conversation we had earlier, but it's an interesting perspective. Technology is often associated with big ag or industry, as we talked about before. Do you see the changing attitudes toward technology as a potential solution for sustainability, changing consumer attitudes toward large-scale ag or big industry, or will they somehow maintain that distaste for big ag and big food and look for technology for other kinds of solutions?
I mean, in the early signals that we're seeing, we think there is potential. It all depends on the initiatives that are actually brought forth by big ag and what those initiatives do ultimately. The consumer's focus is really on the use of technology for better and more sustainable outcomes. If that can be achieved, it will have immense benefits, broad sweeping benefits in terms of consumer trust. 100%. I think everything boils down to, how clearly that's possible to do operationally, and then how clearly that's communicated to the consumer in the end.
Yeah, and I'd piggyback on that and say, and Ujwal's heard me say this before, is the why behind it is really important. Yeah. I think that if a company uses technology and the why is right, I point to a company like Just. They use technology, and a lot of folks see them as, doing the right thing, even though they are highly technical, and they're written up in Wired magazine, right? So it's like you can be both. I think it's the why behind it and I think consumers could accept that.
Yeah, and that would be consistent with our research as well, that it's all about the values, the shared value, and technology in and of itself is values neutral. It's the application of the technology that determines how people feel about it and whether or not they're likely to be supportive of the technology going forward. So Ujwal, there are a couple of questions just asking about how in the world did you identify those 6? Why did you pick those 6? If you could explain a little bit about that, that might be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna try to avoid going into the gory details, but we use 2 technologies of ours called Signals and Trends. Basically, here's the simple way I can explain it. Signals focuses on scouring through millions of consumer conversations, in this case on the issue of sustainability in food, but it's really interested in understanding not just the dominant signals, but understanding the new and emerging early signals of opportunities and threats. It's kind of like a weather system where you're looking at what is developing and what is just starting to enter into the contextual universe and is consistently growing in relevance to the context of food and sustainability. So that's how we identified those 6 signals. They're all early signals of change that have entered into the contextual universe of food and sustainability, and are consistently experiencing growth in maturity. And then once we get those signals, we then apply it into our trends platform to study them. So that allows us to quantify where that trend sits in its relative maturity. How is it that the consumer actually interprets that particular trend? What is their mental model around it? what are their motivations, and how mature or how consistently does the consumer understand what it means to them. But the underlying methodology is very much rooted in observational ethnography. It's in essence an anthropological analysis done with AI and big data.
Great. Okay, here's another one. Pre-COVID, there was a big push to reduce or eliminate single-use plastic. Now that we're seeing people with greater concern about food safety, public health, any insight about how consumers will relate to, and retail, also the brands, how they're going to relate to plastic in the post-COVID world?
Yeah, I can take that just real quick. And it's a tension, right? I've had this conversation with clients before, is that they see that there's this tension between sanitation and hygiene and single-use plastic and convenience aspect. And I think it's going to be a tension for a while. And I think at the moment, I'd be interested to see what Ujwal says. For the moment, I think that a number of consumers are kind of leaning into the sanitation and hygiene portion of it at the moment. They see the purpose behind it. It makes sense, all that kind of stuff. I think that they'll, going back to what I said before, they're going to look to corporations to find a solution, potentially a technological solution, to be able to get to how can I have the sustainable aspect of it and still have the convenient aspect of it that I could have gotten before. So.
I mean, the only, sorry, go ahead, Charlie.
No, I was just asking if you had anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would say is, we keep warning our clients that, we're living in a moment in time where, as consumers, we are forced to behave in a way that isn't consistent with our beliefs. And it's, we have to be careful. I mean, to Kevin's point, we have to be careful to not look at the short-term data and think that this is going to be the new normal. It's not. This is like, people assuming that just because people aren't buying fresh produce in the same way, we're not going to buy fresh produce anymore. That's not going to be the case. So I think that's the only thing I'd add, is that yes, will it impact single-use plastics 100%? What that impact is going to be will be a bit more subtle than we think it is, and we're going to have to study that and understand that long term.
Excellent. So another question here: how do you reconcile the dramatic increase in some of the old name brands, sales of cereals, snacks, soups, with what you say consumers are looking for in bold new initiatives tied to sustainability and technology tied to sustainability?
I think that was on mine. I think that I'm not sure exactly how the question was meant. I think what they're saying, or at least the way I'm interpreting it, is the idea that there seems to be this big spike in people going back to brand names and all that kind of stuff at the moment. And how do you kind of put that? I think big brands and all that kind of stuff can have bold initiatives. And in fact, I think that's kind of what I was trying to lead to, is the idea that that's what they're looking for. I think the push toward bigger names and the idea of the comfort of the big name, I think that's, to what Ujwal said, I think that this is a temporary moment. And I think that you can't rest on your laurels in this liminal space that it is. Coming out of this, when people kind of gather themselves and wake themselves up here, I think they will look for want answers. There'll be a post-COVID, a potential post-COVID reckoning if you don't do something. So I think you need those bold solutions in the back half. You just can't rest on the idea that people are going to want, familiar names and things like that forever.
Okay, so kind of the immediate comfort and falling back, as opposed to what we're going to be looking for going forward.
Exactly.
Okay. Go ahead, Ujwal.
So I was just going to add that, I mean, the other challenge also is just sheer availability, right? There's just, without going into the details of how retailers may or may not work with national brands and may prioritize certain national brands over others, that also plays a huge role in what people are actually able to buy and end up buying.
Yeah.
So let's kind of transition, and I'll give you the question and then maybe reframe it just a little bit. What would a third wave of natural or organic look like? Fewer residues, more functional foods, more local. So as people are looking for these solutions, what do you see in your crystal ball in terms of the kinds of solutions people will be looking for coming out of COVID?
I take it as, I mean, if you, from a sustainability piece, I mean, there's definitely things. When I wrote that one slide, I took it as natural organic in the third wave of that, meaning it's a kind of a combination of some other trends that we've seen before, specifically around this idea of immunity, this idea of holistic body health and things like that. I thought that was an increase of that. If you add in the sustainability piece of it, I think it's potentially in more toward that local piece, because I think that consumers are now seeing local potentially in a different way. And I don't know if that'll continue, but so I think there may be a new way to kind of hook together the natural organic piece with the local piece in a different way. And then that might have something to do with the shortened supply chains as well, and the way in which companies start thinking about that. Yeah, I think a lot of it is a combination of some of the trends that we've already seen before coming together in a different way post-COVID.
It's a great question. You know, if you think about the skincare industry, for example, you know, the term hypoallergenic it has become sort of pervasive. You know, you buy a skincare product and, you know, it's sort of clean and hypoallergenic, and it's a key term now. I think we're going to see that wave with food. And the reason we're seeing that is just because of the heightened awareness of the impact of food on the body during this time, the increased knowledge of the impact of certain key, I'm going to say air quoted, allergens in food, because I know there are a lot of scientists on the call here, so I'm going to air quote it. But it's the consumer's perspective, and it's a big challenge because, you know, whether it's controlling how much dairy I consume or avoiding certain types of you know, proteins, or, you know, even certain formats of proteins, all of these things are what people are becoming hyper aware around. And I think that's the next wave we're going to see. It's less so about whether it's organic or not. It's more so about, you know, is this going to create digestive comfort? So that's one area. And then the other area is we're seeing a wave where finally there's this move away from, at least an initial indication of a move away from miracle solutions. And I think for many of us, that's a very happy thing, because, you know, even if you look at afternoon infomercials, it's all about, you know, just take this one supplement and, you know, your biceps will grow threefold, right? And that extends all the way down to the yogurt industry that has sold, you know, sort of a flat tummy supposedly from just eating yogurt in the morning, or, you know, better digestive health from eating yogurt. And all of that has come into question gradually over the last few years. And I think the big realization is that there is no miracle solution. If I want to improve my immune health, I can't just assume I'm going to eat this small little you know, amount of yogurt and feel like the job's done. It's about having a more holistic look at nutrition. And I think how that will shape up, we will have to wait and see. And going back, Kevin, to your notion of the big, bold idea, I think there's so much that large brands and organizations can do here, because they have so many, they have such a range of products and solutions that can address some of these emerging needs.
Excellent. Okay, interesting question here. Is the adoption of technology to support enhanced sustainability overcoming the drive to create social change in the food chain?
Tough question.
It is a tough question.
I don't know if we've seen enough data to be able to clearly answer that just yet. That's a hard one, and you know, whoever has raised that question, I would say maybe do a follow-up, and we're happy to, at least on our end, I'm happy to look that up and give you a bit of a POV on that.
Yeah.
Kevin, anything from you?
Yeah, I don't know if I would phrase it as a either or question.
Yeah.
Either. So that's the thing, is like if you do technology, you're shortchanging the social aspect of it. I think that from what I've seen, and of course I don't have anywhere near the data that Ujwal and team have, is I don't think it's a one and or thing. So I think I don't think if I was pushed, I think I would say that I don't think that just pushing on technology is going to take away from the social aspect.
Yeah. Well, when you think about it, technology, again, is values neutral, but your company and your brand is not.
Right.
And consumers are not. And
right. And I would also say that no matter what the technology is, people love story. People love that connection. There has to be an emotional connection to it. If it's just the technology piece, it's pretty cold. And I've never met a consumer that just wanted that. There always has to be some emotionality to it. Even a functional aspect is an emotional aspect usually somehow put in there. And the social part is a huge emotional part. So I don't see them living separate.
Yeah, I think to that point, we've also seen, I think, an emergence of people that are doing a better job of storytelling. You might have the same technology that increases efficiency and productivity, but in so doing, it reduces your environmental impact, the amount of water you use, energy you use, et cetera. So which of those attributes do you use to tell your story? And is it increased productivity and efficiency? Maybe if you're talking to Wall Street, but if you're talking to others, it's about your improved sustainability performance and how do you use it in that fashion to tie more closely to those values as opposed to other values.
And actually, just to piggyback on that too, going back to that earlier demand space we discussed around, technology use in dairy to improve the sustainability of dairy farming. I think that's another interesting area where animal welfare isn't, the concerns around animal welfare isn't going away because of the use of technology. Instead, it's the opposite. The concern is that technology should solve for both the emissions and the carbon footprint, as well as the animal welfare component. That human aspect, going back to the point of the story, the human aspect of caring for the animal is still very much part of that. Now, whether that's realistic or not is a whole other question, but from the consumer's perspective, that sort of pastoral image, the way of life of caring for the animal and for the welfare of the animal, still central to the storyline, even if technology is used ultimately to improve the carbon footprint or sustainability outcome.
Excellent. Okay, I am going and putting the survey link in the chat box. So I would ask all of you to go to the chat box. It's really a 3-question, 10-second survey, if you would be kind enough to complete that. One final question for each of you. If you were to make a single recommendation to those in the food system to enhance not their sustainability, just performance, but how they should respond to the question of sustainability or the issue of sustainability in a post-COVID world, what would your take-home point be? What would the recommendation you would make to a client or someone to say, look, in the post-COVID world, I would recommend you do X as it relates to sustainability? So Ujwal, we'll go to you first.
Sounds good. I will say 2 things. The first is try not to get too mired in the short-term data. And it's really hard because I know everybody and I know every leader only cares about COVID right now, but we're going to have to find a way to take a step back and think more holistically about what the consumer really wants. And that relates to the second point, which is, with most of our clients, we see this time and time again, sustainable initiatives are industry-led. And when I say industry-led, what I mean by that is it's led because of a regulatory requirement or change. It's led because there's an efficiency requirement or change, or because there's just pressure from whether it's investors or Wall Street or what have you. And that's an industry lens. What we're really interested in, and this is the work that we always try to do, is to look at the consumer lens of that same sustainability initiative, because oftentimes you'll find that it'll help you reprioritize or in some cases realize that something that you might be doing for a regulatory reason actually has value for the consumer in a way that will extend into your brand, into your story, and so much more. And I think that's the piece that I would say is often forgotten and is critical.
Yeah, and I would really quickly, I would just say very similar to what Ujwal said, but what is, and I say this about every kind of topic, which is make sure that whatever you're doing is in line with what your brand is. Don't just go jumping out there and saying, COVID's the thing, all that. what is, take a moment. This seems like it's, rush to get out there. Take a moment to focus. Who are we? What is our brand? And how can we have a very clear point of view and a very clear brand aligned effort to be able to do something? Because if it's not, it'll never be docked and linked to who you are as a brand. It won't come back to you. You need to make it very brand focused. Take the time and the effort to be focused on what it means and how it connects to your brand.
Excellent. Again, thanks to both of you. It's always terrific to engage with you, and I thank you for your time and your willingness to share your expertise. You can certainly find more about Kevin and Ujwal online, or you can connect with them through us as well. We'd be happy to make that connection. Again, the modules and the other supplemental resources are available at optimizingsustainability.org. You can also get to them through the foodintegrity.org website. We are here to help. Clearly, providing access to experts like Kevin and Ujwal is one of the things that we do with the support of the United Soybean Board. We can also provide customized training to help you navigate through one, two, or all three of those modules, connect you with other great resources like we did today, provide some consultation. Again, we're here to help you optimize sustainability and to navigate this challenging new space. So thank you so much for allowing us to spend some time with you today. Thanks again to Kevin and Ujwal for their expertise and insight. We hope that everyone continues to be safe and does well through the pandemic. If there's anything else we can do to be supportive or helpful, please let us know. Thanks again and have a great afternoon.